They called her worthless, but she owned their entire world. The table looked flawless, every plate aligned with mathematical precision. The silverware gleamed under the warm chandelier light. Crystal glasses stood untouched, reflecting a calm that didn't exist. Everything was perfect, except the atmosphere. It was tight, controlled, suffocating, like a storm waiting for permission to break. She sat at the far end of the table, back straight, hands resting lightly in her lap. Her face was calm, unreadable. Years ago, she had learned something most people never understand. Silence is not weakness. Silence is positioning. So, her mother-in-law began, slicing into her food with deliberate elegance. "How is your little hobby going?" There it was, right on cue. Not loud, not openly cruel. Just precise enough to wound. She looked up slowly, meeting her gaze without hesitation. "It's going well," she replied. A polite smile appeared on the older woman's lips, but it never reached her eyes. "I see," she said softly. "Still no real job, then." A quiet chuckle followed. "Cruel." Her husband shifted slightly beside her, but said nothing. He never did. That was part of the pattern. Silence, avoidance, distance. She had memorized it long ago. "I just think," her mother-in-law continued, "at some point, people need to grow up. A pause, subtle, intentional, and contribute." The word lingered in the air. Contribute, measured in money, status, visibility, things they could understand. She nodded slightly, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just acknowledging, because reacting would only feed them, and she was done feeding them. Across the table, her father-in-law leaned back, studying her like an equation he couldn't solve. "You know," he said, "our son works very hard. I know," she replied calmly. "And what do you do?" he asked. The question sounded simple, but it wasn't. It was a challenge disguised as curiosity. "I manage things," she said. That was enough for her, but not for them. Her mother-in-law smiled again. "Yes," she said. "We've noticed." A pause. Then, "But managing nothing is still nothing." Silence fell heavier this time. This wasn't subtle anymore. This was deliberate. She placed her fork down gently, every movement controlled. "I understand your concern," she said, voice steady. "But you don't understand my work." Her husband finally spoke. "You've never explained it." Rude. She turned her head slightly toward him. "You never asked." The words landed harder than anything said that night, because truth disrupts comfort. The dinner didn't end with shouting. It ended the way tension often does unfinished. Lingering, waiting. The next morning felt different. Still, too still. The kind of silence that signals something has shifted. She woke early, as always. Routine was her anchor. By the time she stepped into the living room, she felt it immediately. The tension. Her father-in-law stood near the window, gripping his phone tightly. Her mother-in-law paced back and forth. Her husband stood in the center of the room, staring at a document like it might change if he read it again. "What happened?" she asked. No one answered. That told her everything. Finally, her husband looked up. "This isn't funny," he said. "I'm not joking," she replied. He held up the paper. "What is this?" She walked closer, glanced at it briefly, then looked back at him. "That," she said, "is a transfer notice." His expression hardened. "For what?" She met his gaze without hesitation. "For ownership. Doing Tume." The room froze. Her father-in-law stepped forward. "Ownership of what?" She paused. Not for drama. For clarity. Everything. Silence. Heavy. Immediate. "This house," she continued. "The company. The assets. All of it. Transferred. Finalized. Legal. Real. That's not possible." Her mother-in-law snapped, her voice sharp now, stripped of its usual control. "It is," she said calmly. It has been for a while. Her husband stared at her, trying to rebuild reality in real time. Why? He asked. Finally, the right question. Because, she said, I built it. Beckett. The room went completely still. For years, they had only seen what was visible, and visibility had fooled them. For a long time, she continued. I worked behind the scenes. She stepped closer, her voice steady. Investments, partnerships, acquisitions. She watched their faces shift. Confusion, disbelief, recognition, and finally, fear. I didn't need attention, she said. I needed control. Her father-in-law shook his head. No, that's not how this works. But it was. And now, he knew. You thought I had nothing, she said. She turned to her husband. And you believed them. That part mattered most. Because betrayal isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet agreement. He said nothing. Because there was nothing to say. The proof was in his hands. You called me worthless, she said. Not emotional. Not angry. Just factual. And yet, everything you value was built by me. The weight of that truth settled slowly. Her mother-in-law sat down heavily, as if her legs could no longer support her. This is manipulation, she whispered. No, she said softly. This is clarity. She took a small step back, giving them space, because truth doesn't need to push. It just needs to exist. For a long time, she said, I let you define me. A pause. That was my mistake. Her husband spoke again, quieter now. You should have told me. Maybe. But that wasn't the real issue. You should have asked, and for Stant. Silence. Different this time. Not tense. Not aggressive. Empty. Because the version of reality they had lived in was gone. She picked up her bag. Calm. Steady. Finished. Where are you going? He asked. She looked at him. Really looked. For the first time in a long time. Forward. She turned. Walked to the door. Opened it. And stepped outside. The air felt different. Lighter. Clearer. Not because they finally understood her, but because she no longer needed them to. And that was the real shift. Not proving your worth. Not fighting for validation. Not explaining yourself to people who never intended to understand, but removing access to your value, to your energy, to your presence. People often believe power is loud. That success must be visible. That worth needs to be proven. But real power doesn't announce itself. It builds quietly, moves strategically, and reveals itself only when necessary. They saw silence and assumed weakness. They saw absence and assumed failure. They saw nothing because they weren't looking closely enough. And by the time they finally understood, it was already too late. Because the truth is simple. The most dangerous person in the room is the one no one is paying attention to.